to the cloud. Okay. All right, welcome to our warm season veggie gardening talk today. I'm going to close that. Okay. All right. This is our first time doing a hybrid class in person and online. This is weird, but I'll get used to it. Okay. So today we're going to talk about warm season veggie gardening, presented to you by the San Bernardino County Master Gardeners, and we're happy to have you here in person and also online if you're joining us online. Hold on, remote problems. That was short-lived. Just a second, remote challenges. I don't need the remote probably. Oh, nothing is working. Just a second. There we go. Okay, so the presentation is being recorded and feel free to ask questions. I see we have somebody who just joined. So feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll get to those. For those of you who just joined, we also have a live audience. So when we have questions, I'll repeat those questions. Please turn off your cameras to save bandwidth. And that's why I have my camera off too. Let's see, I'll turn it on for just a second. There I am, and we're here live. I would turn the computer around, but it has too many cords attached to it. But good morning. Okay, and then we'll post a PDF of this presentation on our website, and that can be found on the website homepage under recent presentations. And you can also save the links that we drop in the chat. Okay, so we're the San Bernardino County Master Gardeners. We're part of the Division of Agriculture. I remember you guys are out there. Agriculture and Natural Resources. And you'll see in a lot of our publications, it says UCCE. And we're basically trained volunteers who educate the public on growing food, sustainable landscaping, and better living through gardening, and share peer-reviewed research that's scientific based with the public. But we're just really enthusiastic gardening cheerleaders, I would say. And so our office and the Master Gardener program is administered at a county level through cooperative extension offices. You've probably heard that term, cooperative extension. And in our cooperative extension office, then we have FNEP, the nutrition program. 4-H is one of our programs. We have Master Food Preservers. They're going to be presenting at about 11:45. I'm not sure if they're going to be doing a hybrid version, but they are presenting in just a little bit. We also have academic advisors. And if you want to learn more, you can check out our website at cesanbernardino.com. We have a seed library, our presentation for seed saving. Each month we do a presentation on seed saving. And our presentation this month will be yet to be determined, but we will be doing a March presentation on seed saving. This month's presentation, we talked about seed saving from cool season veggies. So if you want to check that out, that should be up on our YouTube channel that you can find under the resources page. Our seed library used to be at 2 physical locations in Montclair and Yucaipa, but those are both still closed. But we're going to have pop-up seed libraries at the Highland Library. So at the second Saturday of each month, if you want to go to the Highland Library, we have free seeds for the public. So come check that out. And then we're going to hopefully do that in Yucaipa as well. And then in the high desert, they've been looking at doing that. And potentially in Upland, we have a location that might like to have a seed library as well. So we're looking at having those free seeds, but part of our seed library is also just doing seed saving classes. So that's part of our Master Gardener program. Really quickly, I'm going to do a little public service announcement on emerging pests. You may have heard this before, but it's really important that we spread the word and not the pests. So I'll go through it real quick and then we'll get back to our warm season veggie talk. But basically, there is a terrible citrus disease out there, citrus greening disease, also known as Huang Long Bing or HLB. And the disease is fatal to citrus. It's not harmful to people, but it's fatal to citrus. So we want to prevent the spread of this disease. Florida has no backyard citrus at all. And for those master gardeners who are listening, this is really important. There's still a lot of people who don't know about this. And we're going to be doing a presentation in Ontario on March 23rd. at 6 p.m. and we'll be posting that on our website. Ontario is a really big hotspot for citrus greening. The disease is really spreading in that area. The disease has been found all over Southern California, unfortunately, within these blue lines here. The insect, there's an insect that spreads the disease, and that's everywhere. So if you have citrus, you most likely have this insect. Unless you're in the high desert, they don't seem to like those higher elevations. So that's good. But I know citrus does struggle a little bit in the desert. But if you're in Southern California, most likely you have the insect in your yard that spreads the disease, and the disease has been found within these blue lines. The insect is spread just like a mosquito spreads malaria by the Asian citrus psyllid, which is this tiny insect on the upper left-hand side of the screen. And it is about the size of a half of a grain of rice. And just like a mosquito spreads malaria, did I say that already? Then the insect spreads the disease. It feeds on an infected plant. It's a disease is caused by a bacteria, and it spreads the disease when it goes to feed on the next plant. The early symptoms of the disease are going to be on the lower left, this leaf discoloring where it's like asymmetrical yellowing on it here on the, oops, here on this part of the screen right there. And then the later symptoms are this discoloration of the fruit here with the greening. That's why they call it citrus greening. And then the fruit will be misshapen and the seeds will be brown or dead. And so those are the later symptoms. They're finding a lot of these infected trees in Ontario. The way the state is responding is that when the infected trees are found, they remove the trees immediately. And they're trying to slow the spread of this disease. So we can together help slow the spread of this disease. Just really quickly, here on the left is something you'll see very commonly in the spring. That's the citrus leaf miner. Almost every time we have an information table as master gardeners or we're out in the public, people will say that their leaves are very disformed. The picture on the left there looks very bad. I mean, it really looks infected, but that's a citrus leaf miner, which is mostly cosmetic. The picture on the right-hand side here, these are the symptoms of citrus greening, and it's this asymmetrical yellowing on the leaf, where it's kind of, they call it blotchy mottling. That blotchy mottling is the symptoms of the citrus greening disease. So on the left-hand side here, that is not citrus greening. It looks terrible, but your trees are still photosynthesizing, and this is usually just seasonal. So most people just leave it in and don't really worry about it. So together we can prevent the spread of this disease and the insect. And one of the ways is not to share stems and leaves when we're sharing fruit. A lot of people, in a lot of areas in that blue line, it's actually illegal to share fruit, but there's such an abundance of citrus and such a lack of awareness of the disease that people share fruit all over the place. I see on social media, everybody is sharing fruit. And if you imagine that this insect, which spreads the disease, is the size of a half a grain of rice here on the upper left-hand side, then look how tiny the eggs are right below it in diagram C, or photo C. And so you can see that if you're sharing citrus with stems and leaves, you might be unknowingly sharing those leaves. So I try to control myself on social media, and every once in a while, but people post these, come by my house and get these lemons and there's stems and leaves. And I think it's like, they look pretty with the stems and leaves, right? And so we leave them intentionally, but you could be either sharing with the public or receiving citrus that has this insect, and the insect may be carrying the bacteria. So don't share stems and leaves. These insects, they like the new growth, so they're not usually close to the fruit, to the top of the fruit. So if you remove the stems and leaves, you really reduce the chance of spreading the insect. Also cuttings, that's how it came into California. Most likely the disease came in through cuttings. And so it's also illegal to share cuttings. But I still hear a lot of people talking about, oh, I have this tree in Loma Linda and I'm going to bring a cutting up to Highland. Very easy to have a tree. It takes about 9 months to a year to 2 for the symptoms of the disease to show up. So healthy looking wood can be infected. So you don't want to share cuttings with people. You might be unknowingly sharing infected wood, and you don't want to receive cuttings from people either. And if you are a person that likes to do grafting, then there is a source of clean budwood available. The other step is to keep ants out of your trees and plants. And so I'm going to just spend a little bit longer on this because this is really important for warm and cool season veggie gardening too. So if you see this picture here, then the ants, there's these little droplets, and these are like a honeydew that the Asian citrusillid larvae produces as it feeds on the plant. So there's kind of a close-up here, and you can see it has like this honeydew solution. So this is the same thing that happens with aphids. They don't make these waxy tubules like an aphid would, but as they feed on the plant, they're excreting a honeydew solution. Scales do that. Whiteflies do that, aphids, any of the piercing sucking insects, they're feeding on the plant tissue. So their excrement is sweet, and the ants like to farm that. So a lot of people think that the ants farm the insect, but they don't. They protect the insect from beneficial predators. So some beneficial predators we're all familiar with on the lower right-hand side is the lady beetle and the lady beetle larva there on the lower right-hand side. A syrphid fly is one of my favorite beneficial predators because the adult is pretty cool. It sort of hovers around and it looks like a bee. And then the larvae is a really hungry predatory animal. So they'll eat a lot of aphids. They eat the Asian citrusillid larvae. And then up on the upper right-hand side is a parasitic wasp. And parasitic wasps, there's a lot of different kinds of parasitic wasps. This is the one that eats the larvae of the Asian citrusillid. So right here is the larvae of the Asian citrusillid, and the Tamarixia or parasitic wasp lays its eggs in there. But what the ants will do is the ants will throw these beneficial predators out of the tree, or if you have cabbage or you have roses, if you have aphids or scale or whiteflies or some sort of piercing sucking insect like the Asian citrusillid larvae, the ants will throw ladybugs out. It's kind of cool if you like to Google or do an internet search for videos. You can see them throwing them out. They'll all respond very quickly when a beneficial predator lands, and they'll throw them out of the plant. So what we want to do, and one way we can use the ants as an indicator that we have a pest. So with all of your warm or cool season veggies, if you see ants in your plants, that's a sign you have some sort of pest in your garden. So they're helpful in that way. But once you've identified them, you want to manage them in the garden so that the beneficial predators can come in and do their job. So those are the 3 steps. Don't share stems and leaves, don't share cuttings, and manage ants in your plants. We'll talk about pest management a little bit more, and I'll show you a website where you can find some information about ant management. For more information on citrus greening disease, we have this website that will be on our list of resources that we'll post. If you have figs at home, there's the black fig fly to be on the lookout for. And it's been found in Orange County and I think LA County, not in San Bernardino County, but if you have early fig drop that's sort of mysterious and not related to water, or you see like these little marks inside of your fruit, that could be a sign, and there's a website that will be on our resource sheet. And then there's also been medfly detection, unfortunately, in upland. And so this happened a couple of years ago in Devore, and there is no management on the homeowner level for medflies, because if you're old enough to remember the malathion spraying of the 80s and 90s, then I guess the 80s, then they're very quick to respond. So anybody within this quarantine, this is upland here in the center, anybody within this quarantine, fruit is supposed to stay on the property and not to be moved off the property. What they're doing in response is they release sterile medflies, and then that controls the population. So the quarantine started on November 16th, and they're hoping to lift it in June. And if you are in the area, really following the guidelines of not moving fruit off the property is important to reduce the quarantine time. So back to today's presentation about that. So that was my information on emerging pests. Back to today's presentation. And so we'll talk about knowing your microclimate, knowing your soil, plant selection, site selection, planting techniques, irrigation, care and maintenance, seed saving, growing herbs, and then I'll share the resources. Sorry. Okay, so today we're going to talk about just the basics that you need for growing your warm season veggie garden. As the spring continues, we will do more specific presentations on different vegetables. So lots more to come from us on growing vegetables, but these are sort of an overview of the basics. So we'll start with knowing your microclimate. A lot of people use the USDA zones, and for the most part in our area, we're the USDA zone 9. But that really doesn't take into account all of the factors in California. So if you're a gardener, you're probably familiar with the sunset zones, and those are more specific to our area. And so whereas most of San Bernardino County, and I forgot to say, so the USDA zones are based on the date of the last frost. And a lot of parts of California don't have a hard frost. So I was actually thinking February 28th, Monday, will be our officially, like, February is our coldest time of the year. And so we have kind of passed our official last frost date by the end of this month. But if you remember, if you follow the eagles in Big Bear, and you remember there's like a webcam for the eagles in Big Bear and they have a nest, and there was snow like in Memorial Day. If you remember, like 3 years ago, it didn't really work out very well for the eagle babies. But you have to be careful. Our climate in the last couple of years has been very unstable. So we'll talk more about that. But generally, like in the places in the upper part of the United States, or in the more southern parts of the United States, then there's a lot more consistency to that to the last frost date or not. I don't know if other states have sunset zone type stuff. But in our county, we have 5 sunset zones. And then that reminds you, that's what I was going to say. So there are some parts of the county that do have a frost date, like the end of the last frost date, which would be in the Big Bear, Crestline, and they can follow USDA zones pretty reliably when it comes to planting. But down here in the Inland Empire, up in the high desert, they don't really work as well for us. So like the frost date for, I think in the mountains, they generally say they don't plant before Mother's Day. So the end of the last frost date would approximately be that time. And then their frost, I think, begins in November or October. So they have those cold periods. And so if you think about it, like if you've seen, I don't know if you've seen cherry tomatoes, that in a Mediterranean climate that doesn't have that colder weather, they can trellis indeterminate cherry tomatoes and have them grow just continuously and be these massive trellises of cherry tomatoes. So a lot of these plants, if there's not a hard frost, then they can last for many seasons. But so the frost date generally, like for this area, would be December through February is our kind of frost window in the Inland Empire area. And probably maybe up in the high desert, it starts a little bit earlier, but generally by February is the end. So Lake Arrowhead is a sunset zone 7, Victorville and Barstow are a 10 and 11. And then most of the Inland Empire is going to be an 18 or 19. And these, the mountain areas with the sunset zones, if you go to their website and then you look, for example, at zone 7, which is the mountain area, then they talk about more in depth about the season. And so none of us are here from the mountain areas. So if we go to like the high desert, then it shows the growing season is April to early November. And it talks a little bit about the expected low temperatures. And then in the valleys, it talks about the different, the summers are hot and dry, the rain comes in the winter, as opposed to some areas of like Arizona that they get a lot of summer rains. So most of the West Coast has these sunset zones. And if you look at their website under Sunset Western Garden Collection climate zones, then it's kind of interesting because you see a more of a description. But basically in the Inland Empire here, we're impacted by continental air masses that are moving in, as opposed to being in, for example, like a coastal area, then it's much more temperate. And a really different, like Los Angeles is impacted by coastal air masses moving in, and we're impacted by the continental air masses. So beyond that microclimate, which is really important in placing the right plant in the right place, then you also have your microclimate in your yard. And so some of the things that impact your microclimate are going to be the orientation toward the sun. Is your gardening space an eastern exposure or a western exposure? The wind patterns in your area, which has really been for all of us this spring, well, whatever, the last two months has just really impacted. There's been some school gardens that we've gone to that the drying effect of that wind, you know, we had this deluge of rain right at the end of 2021, right? And then with all of the winds that have just been, like Claremont, we just really got hit by that one really bad wind. But the Fontana all the way up through the pass, and that, like, it's just been constant. It hasn't really stopped. And so that has a huge drying effect. And so where you place your garden in your yard, I mean, you and your neighbor two down, or even you and your neighbor could have a very different microclimate based on the wind that you have. So like, for example, one of the people, there's a jazz festival here. See, lots of stuff. You guys should come check us out live. But so like one of the people that's in our audience today has a garden that's in upland, but it has a really large fence on it. And so all of that citrus is very protected from the wind, as opposed to other citrus, which might be open in the front of somebody's yard. And that citrus probably needs a lot less water because it's not getting that wicking effect of the wind drying the soil. There's also heat islands around your garden, you know, where the road is, where the pathways are, what sort of radiating heat there is off your home. The dips and hills on the property make a big difference in terms of like one of the suggestions, if you're planting fruit trees and they need more chill hours, you should plant it at a low spot in your yard because cold air settles. And then there's shading caused by your house and your fence. And if you started a garden in the winter, then usually you're okay because the sun is more south. And for the most part, because vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of sun a day to have a really successful crop, then, you know, most of the time what will happen is in the summer, the sun is going to go more north. So if wherever you made a raised bed, it's most likely to, or you have your pots or you have your in-ground plants, they're more likely to have direct overhead sun in the summer. But what happens to a lot of people is when they make a garden space in the summer, then in the wintertime, that space may be completely shaded by a tree on the south. There's a garden in Loma Linda, and it's this beautiful garden on top of a hill, like literally on top of a hill. There's nothing else on top of the hill. And there's a giant shade tree about 100 or 50 feet away. And in the winter, the garden is completely in the shade and doesn't get any sun at all. So they have this beautiful garden, like you're looking up at the sun and it's completely in the shade. So think about that when you're planting your garden, because that summer sun is going to be different than your winter sun. So for those of you guys who attended in person, we brought a little kit for a soil jar test. And if you want to get to know your soil, and this is something that master gardeners do when they go through the training class, and this is one of their first assignments that will get posted, is they get to know their soil. And so this is not a soil test for chemicals or a soil test for pH. This is a soil test for texture. And so what you're going to do is, well, let's go back one. You're going to, in your jar that you got if you came in person, then you'll fill your jar up about halfway with soil. You'll add water, and you're going to give it a really good shake, and you're going to let it sit overnight. And so, or between 24 and 48 hours. And what's going to happen is the heavier particles are going to settle out to the bottom here. And then your fine sand is going to be, or clay is going to be here in the middle layer, and then the top layer is going to be the silt. So if you look at this triangle diagram here, then you have the clay on top, you have the silt on the right-hand corner, and then you have sand on the left-hand corner. And most plants do best in a sandy loam. So most of the northern part of the Inland Empire has a pretty nice sandy loam, but because it's an alluvial plain, then all of that silt has pushed its way over thousands of years down into the Chino, down into the south part of the valley. So from Chino all the way through to Redlands, they often have a lot of clay in their soil. And so you have the clay here, and the sandy loam that I referenced is sort of half clay, probably 3/4 sand, and then part clay and part silt. So if you're in the south part of the Inland Empire, then you're probably going to have very heavy soil, very clay-like soil. It's a very small particle and it drains really slowly. So if you are gardening in that area, the best way to test in the ground, and we'll go back to the soil test in just a second, but the best way to test in the ground, like if you're going to plant a tree, is you want to dig a hole. And then I live in the northern part of the valley in Claremont, and this just cracks me up, but they say the soil should drain within 8 hours if you fill up the hole. At my house, it's draining while I'm filling it up. I have so much sand. That's really good because the roots don't like to sit in water. But if it sits for more than 8 hours in the hole, that's too heavy. It's too much clay. And you can amend heavy soil by adding compost to improve the drainage. It helps aerate it out. The cool thing about compost is if your sand is very, very your soil is very sandy, then in places like the high desert, there's some places I know that have a very sandy soil, but not as many as you think. It's a lot of clay in the high desert, it seems like, more than I thought. Then you can add compost and it helps improve water retention. So compost helps with drainage in heavy clay soil, and compost helps with water retention in sandy soil. But so say you want to plant in an area of your yard and you want to know if it's a good place to plant plants, then you can do this soil jar test. And what you would hope to see is something where it's about like this, where about half of it is sand and then a little bit is silt. And then here it says fine sand, but that would be sort of the clay portion. So this right here that you see represents a sandy loam. So again, you fill your jar about halfway with soil, you add water, you give it a good shake, you let it sit for 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes if you let it sit for 24 hours and the soil is still kind of homogeneous and you can't really see the layers are pretty visible. Then you can shake it up again, and you want to shake it for a couple minutes to really break apart the soil pieces into the different size particles, and then let it sit for another day. And you can take a picture of it and send it to the Master Gardener Helpline if you'd like help interpreting it. But otherwise you can note, so if you have soil like this, for example, it's great for planting your plants. If the soil is mostly clay, then you know you're going to need to amend it, or you're going to need to plant in pots. Okay, are there any questions about the soil jar test? I think most of our participants, except for one, has done the soil jar test in person. So if you're at home, then you can look it up online, the soil jar test, or reach out to our Master Gardener Helpline and we can give you information about that. So a good question. Doesn't matter if it's plastic or glass, the jar. And I brought glass jars today, but we're going to look at Gatorade jar bottles, and we want something that you can just see through. So it even could be like a plastic water bottle. You just have to get the soil into the hole. So it can be plastic or glass. Always be careful with glass out in the garden, right? But you just want to be able to see through it, and you want to be able to see your results. So a Gatorade bottle is what I might bring to our next in-person class if we can get that, where I think you can see through that pretty well. And the hole is big enough to actually put soil in. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. Thank you. Okay, so you always want to consult a veggie planting chart. And if you were able to join us in person, we have all of our free seeds available, and they're all sorted by warm and cool season. So if you are planting, then you'll notice on this chart here on the right, you see C and W. And C and W stands for warm and cool season. And basically what makes something a warm season veggie is that it's something that will tolerate the heat and definitely needs the longer days. The cool season veggies are going to bolt, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, and they can tolerate the shorter days and perhaps need the cooler soil temperatures. Like carrots and radishes can be grown for the most part year round. But if the temperature in the soil gets too hot, they won't make a good bulb or root. Carrots do a little bit better, but if you've ever grown radishes where they just end up like little stringy things with no bulb and the leaves look very healthy, it's because the soil was too warm. Okay, so let's look a little bit more. I'm going to go back to that in just a sec. Well, we'll look at the planting chart. We'll go. So we have our warm and cool season veggies right here in March. In February and March and September and October, you're sort of in the challenging season in the Inland Empire. It's where they always show those social media posts about fake summer fake spring, second winter, all these different things. We have so much variation. But basically right now, in the end of February, we are looking at planting our summer crop. Most vegetables take between a couple days to a week or 10 days to sprout. And then they want to be 4 to 6 weeks old before they go into the ground. So if you imagine right now, last week of February, by the time a tomato, for example, sprouted, you're looking at about 7 weeks, 8 weeks before you put it in the ground. That means you're putting it in the ground in March, in the middle of April. Perfect timing to get those summer veggies in the ground. But it's still a little bit cool, and you can probably still grow most cool season veggies. Not all of them, but so if you look right here at the chart, then you can see you have the one in dark green this is for seed planting. And so you can see for dark green, things like asparagus, you still see beets, broccoli you can see, so like beets you could plant year round, and this would be for the Inland Empire and probably mostly the high desert, not for the mountains. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. You can still collards, endive, kale, kohlrabi. Those things you can all plant still, but those are in the Brassica family. So those are again, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, kale. Those things, they take about, I think it's about 95 to 110 days. So about, 3 to 4 months to be ready to harvest. And if you think for those things, when you're planting them right now in the Inland Empire, in 3 to 4 months, what's going to be going on? It's probably going to be really hot. And so we're right at the end of that season. So you would want to, if you're planting any of the Brassica family, you would want to be planting something that's an early harvest variety. Great for people in the mountains. If it wasn't frozen, like they can plant like they have to worry now about freezing, but they don't have to worry about that summer heat. But so for us, it's sort of the end of those cool season veggies, but things like lettuce and carrots and the beets, those things will still do very well. For like lettuce is fairly quick to harvest, so you can get a good harvest before we get. Now if we have a short if we have a short spring and it gets very warm, then they may go to seed, and we'll talk about seed, or to flower and then to seed, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Other things you could plant. Okay, so going back to this, so you see some of these that are on the light green is the kind of like acceptable range, but it's a little bit late to plant. So you'll see a lot of the cool season veggies here are wrapping up, and a lot of the warm season veggies you're starting. So the beans you can start pretty soon. You can start the again, the carrots and the beets are kind of year round depending on your conditions. Cantaloupe, still a little bit cold for cantaloupe. Corn, cucumbers, and eggplant, it's still a little bit cold. They're a little bit more cold susceptible, so you might want to wait a little bit longer. And then like lima beans is still a little bit early in okra. Peppers, it says peppers and tomatoes, it says to wait to start until March or April, but I know a lot of people who start them in January, and it's always a gamble when you start those seeds in January, because if we have a long spring, a long winter, then the tomatoes will be, like all leggy and just like they look like a bean pole, like a bean sprout. And then if we have a really short winter and an early spring, those people who planted the seeds in January, they get an early start and they have tomatoes in May. So everybody who plants tomatoes and peppers in January, they're like gambling. And I know last year they're like, what am I going to do with all my tomatoes? It's still cold. But definitely if you're going to do from seeds, your tomatoes and peppers, it's probably not too early to start right now. And then what else? The radishes year round, potatoes. You could be wrapping up and still planting. Your squash and your summer squash and winter squash, you'll be planting now. Those take, the winter squash is really interesting. Like the summer squash, we eat it as an immature plant. But if you, I was like, what's the difference between a summer and a winter squash? And it really is what we typically would harvest it as. So we're harvesting the summer squash as immature plants, and the winter squash, they're just mature. So like, for example, if you're doing seed saving, those cucumbers, all the squash, those things are immature. And if we let them go through into the fall, they're already in the fall and winter, but some of them we want them to be soft skinned, and some of them we want them to be a harder skinned, like a pumpkin, for example. I don't know, you probably could eat an immature pumpkin. I don't know what it tastes like, but you probably could eat it in the summer. And so there's actually, it's more of a culinary distinction between summer and winter squash and when we typically harvest. But generally you plant them at the same time. You can plant sunflowers, Swiss chard, turnips, watermelon. Also like cantaloupe, it's a little bit early for them. And then your zucchini you can plant. So for selecting your plants, you just want to plant what your family likes. And I encourage you to plant what your family likes and maybe what they want to eat, and plant what your family doesn't like, because things grown at home have a really different flavor, a much sweeter flavor. Things that have been in the grocery store, all of the sweetness kind of gets lost from those things, and they're often harvested early so that they can be transported before they get too soft. You're thinking about season. So for us, it's basically kind of going into warm season and wrapping up cool season. This time of year, you could plant both warm and cool season plants. Giving some thought, the warm season plants might need a little protection from the cold, and the cool season plants might go to flower too early. And so we're in between the seasons. The fall doesn't have quite that same pattern because we'll often have a lot of heat into the late fall. And so those cool season plants just won't thrive as well in that in-between season. You want to be thinking about, if you're saving seeds, then you should check out our seed saving classes to see what varieties you should pick. You can grow your plants from seeds. Now is a great time to start a lot of seeds. Transplants give you that sort of instant garden look. Transplants can be better if you're a newer gardener, because getting a plant from seed and through those first couple of inches as it's growing out of the soil, it's really susceptible to dampening off, where it just sort of dies, not for no reason, but it appears to die for no reason. And so if you want that, something that's a little bit easier than a transplant is a good way to go for your veggies. Root vegetables don't do that well as transplants. So if you are growing carrots or radishes, there's one other one, doesn't transplant well at all. So you'd want to start those from seeds. And then cuttings like berries, you can grow from cuttings. So here's our typical warm season veggies. We have our peppers, tomatoes, cantaloupe, corn, and squash. And our cool season veggies are peas and carrots and Brussels sprouts and broccoli and lettuce and cauliflower. Do you guys notice something about what type of crops these are versus what type of crops or what type of part of the plant they are? Okay, so the cool season veggies, you'll notice that only one of them is a fruit. So from a botanical point of view, a fruit is something with seeds in it. And so most of our cool season veggies, where's my picture? There we go. I'm going to go back to that. So most of our cool season veggies, I got to move this picture, are going to be non-fruit parts of the plant. So most of our summertime veggies, you'll notice the corn, the melons, the squash, those are all the fruits of the plant. And that's why they need that heat and they need those longer days. For most of our cool season veggies, they're going to be leaves, they're going to be stems or shoots, and then maybe root vegetables. So for the cool season veggies, you're going to be looking at, so that's one way, like if you're looking at the seeds and you can sort of guess, is this a cool season or a warm season? For the most part, the warm season are going to be where we're eating the fruits. So for slight selection, we already talked about the summer sun and the winter sun are at different angles. So we already talked about that. We want to find the right spot for your garden. The basic needs are they need enough sunlight, they need enough space to grow, they need the right amount of water, and water is probably, like for our Master Gardener helpline, I think that water is probably, watering related issues are our number one thing that we get questions about. They need enough nutrients and a high quality soil or mulch. So most veggies require at least 6 hours of daylight. And you need to make sure for the summer veggies that they have access to pollination. So for our winter veggies, when we're eating mostly this lower part of the plant here, they don't need access to pollination. And if you think about a lot of the pollinators, that's the butterflies and the moths, which as juveniles, they're troublemakers because they're eating the leaves as caterpillars and larvae of our plants. So a lot of times when we want to keep bugs out, it's to keep the larvae, the caterpillars, from eating our leaves. And so we want to protect them from the bugs, but the bugs are also the pollinators, right? So for your cool season veggies, you can do a lot of covering of these plants because they don't need pollinators, but the warm season veggies are going to flower and then they're going to go to fruit and they're going to need access to pollinators. So warm season veggies can be a little bit challenging because we need to protect them from the bugs, but they also need access to the bugs, right? So I really like this this garden on the lower left, how it has these screens that you can open in the daytime to provide access to pollinators. But so like, for example, if you had lettuce growing here, you wouldn't need to open those at all unless you're seed saving from the lettuce. The lettuce doesn't need access to pollinators. It doesn't go to flower. It doesn't make the fruit. The broccoli, the cabbage, cauliflower, kale, all of those things, they don't need access to pollinators. The one fruit that we eat in the winter, peas, are self-pollinating. They actually don't really usually need access to pollinators either. So you could have this closed all winter and really protect your plants from bugs, but in the summer you would have to open it up so that they could get access to pollinators. Spacing is really important for your plants. I really like this picture here on the left. You've got your, you can tell it's a cool season because you have a nice healthy bed of lettuce and then something that looks like a broccoli or cabbage and then some more lettuce and some other brassica family. So this is some sort of cool season garden. They also have some marigolds and they have nasturtiums. Everything has a lot of space. It looks really pretty. I want to note that a lot of people will use nasturtiums to companion plant. Nasturtiums are an edible flower. You can actually eat the flower and the leaves and even the seeds you can make a caper out of. They're a little bit spicy, but that plant will, so they put it here to probably keep aphids out of the lettuce. And so it's like a trap crop. But if you think if all the aphids are going over to the nasturtiums, at some point in time, the balance is going to tip and the nasturtiums become a farm for aphids to reinfest your lettuce. So if you are using a plant as a trap crop, you're going to have to be willing to pull it out or to treat it or to manage the pests that are growing on there. So if this attracted a lot of aphids and you treated it with some sort of organic or non-organic pesticide, then you wouldn't want to eat probably the leaves like you would if you didn't treat it. So just keep that in mind. The marigold is also planted to repel pests, but the scientific evidence doesn't seem to show that, because if the pests are in the garden and the marigold repels the pest is going to go to the vegetable because it's repelled from the flower. So this is, I have this example in here because it's two interesting examples of like a trap crop and a repellent crop, which have limited scientific evidence behind them working. Doesn't mean you can't try it in your garden. The one that I found that's like pretty successful is that gophers don't seem to like daffodils. And so I plant daffodils around my roses. But even then, I don't know scientific research, how it pans out, but that does sort of work in my yard. So with companion planting, you have to sort of do it and experiment around. But for spacing in the garden, then you want to make sure that all of your plants have enough space. And you want to follow, like if you have a seed packet, you want to follow those directions. Oh, I don't have, so this is an example of a square foot garden. And this was really common in World War II, the victory gardens where they had everybody planting their own garden. And there's a lot of charts you can find online that will show you like in a square foot, how many plants you can plant. So like I thought there was a photo in here, but so for example, you can plant 16 radishes in a square foot, and you can plant 2 lettuces in a square foot, and you can plant 1 tomato in a square foot. And so in a garden that's like 3 by whatever this is, 6 or 7, each one of these would represent a crop. And a lot of people grow their plants this way. And they're utilizing having these plants so close together. Like for example, if you had a root vegetable, like a radish here in the front, and then here you had like a lettuce, and then maybe here on this, say this was the last square, these were beans, then this one, the beans would be growing up into the sky. The lettuce would be using that first 4 to 6 inches of kind of air space, and then the radishes would be growing into the ground. Then the beans would be fixing nitrogen into the soil. So there's a lot of ways you can grow really dense plantings, but if you have things like anything in the squash family, melons, cucumbers, those things like a lot of room. So they say 2 square feet per one plant, but the squash didn't read the book and they're like, oh, I'll just take over the whole bed. So if you are using this sort of square foot gardening type space, be mindful of keeping the squash and melons on the end, and you may need to direct them. The other thing that I've noticed is that a lot of times people like to trellis their beans on the edge of a bed, and you want to do that keeping in mind where the shade is being cast from those beans. So probably better, if you think about it, if you have your beans on the east side, so they create a wall, they limit the sunlight on everything to the west of it, right? Because it's casting that shadow. If you have your beans on the west side of your bed, it's all that some afternoon sun is being blocked. And so maybe you want to put your beans facing east west, so they're on the south side. Does that make sense? So that they're not casting a long shadow into your garden. Alternatively, going back to the microclimates, maybe if you wanted to grow lettuce, you put your beans on the west side, and in the afternoon they'll provide shade to your lettuce and keep it a little bit cooler. So there's a lot of ways you can play around with plant spacing, but you do want to make sure you read the packages. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to the Master Gardener helpline, and you want to make sure you give your plants enough space to grow. So for seeds, you want to read the directions. You want to plant the seeds at the correct depth. Usually a rule of thumb for the correct depth is to be about twice as deep as the size of the seed. So like mint seeds and strawberry seeds are very small and they just sit right on the surface. A radish seed is a little bit bigger and it's usually about 1/4 of an inch down. And then a bean, a little bit larger seed, is usually about 1/2 inch down. There are a few exceptions, but basically you want to plant a seed about twice as deep as it is big. Okay. And you want to keep the soil evenly moist, avoid overwatering. It's a good idea to water your soil before you plant your seeds. My grandma used to, when we did zinnia seeds, which sit right on the surface of the soil and you just sprinkle soil on top of them, she would lay a newspaper on top and then she would water the newspaper so that it wouldn't float the seeds out of the soil. It would keep the soil evenly moist. She would check it regularly. And then when they were just about when you start to see them sprouting, then you pull the paper off. They've already got a root in. So that's one way to protect your seeds. But definitely if you have no protection, you want to use like a watering can or a gentle spray for starting your seeds. You want to make sure, it's really hard. I hate doing this, but like for your seeds, you want to thin them out. If you have, if you like, the carrot seeds are super small and you drizzle them into the soil and then they all pop up. And if you don't have, if you think you want a carrot to be about 1 inch or so in diameter, probably, then it needs like 2 inches between the carrot for the shoulder of each of the carrot to grow, right? And so you've got to thin those darn seeds out. And I always try to replant them or save them. I tried to eat the radish greens. That didn't. They're pretty stringy. But you should have to thin your seeds out to make sure. That's okay. Yeah, and so then the question was, this is how you get these carrots that are often like wrapped around each other. And carrots and radishes. If you think anything that grows in the soil, potatoes not as much, but anything that grows in the soil, it's going to be deformed and shaped by what's in the soil. So you want the soil to be really light and fluffy for those things. That's the other thing that happens, is that maybe the soil isn't loose enough. And so one of our people who teaches our Master Gardener class, Yvonne Savio, she likes to grow, I think it's lettuce or next to her carrots, because the lettuce roots keep the soil loose while the carrots are sprouting. And then she harvests the lettuce as the carrots are really getting big, but it keeps that soil loose. I can't remember what her companion plant is there. So you want to make sure you thin your seedlings out. A lot of farms have gone to using transplants in the farm setting rather than direct sowing into the ground, because if you put out 50 seeds and a snail comes by or a bird comes by who doesn't leave any evidence, you're just waiting for those seeds like forever, and you don't know what if something happened to them. So a lot of farms are starting to grow, it's more small scale farms, but they're starting to grow seeds in the little containers and then planting them into the soil when they're 4 to 6 inches tall, and they get a better yield. So that's a great way, so for transplants, you can buy them at the store, or you can grow your own seeds and then transplant them in the garden. You want to keep the soil at the same level, except for tomatoes. Tomatoes are one that you can plant deeper because it will grow roots off the side of it. But for the most part, you want to keep all the other plants at the same level for your transplants. You want to gently remove them from the container, and then be sure to water them well and keep them evenly moist. And it's important to remember for transplants, whether you grew it yourself or whether you bought it from the store, that the transplant will have kind of the water will tend to go, it will be easier for the water to go around the little plant plug than to saturate in, especially if the plug is a little bit dry. So a lot of times you'll water the soil, but the plug may not soak up that water. So you want to make sure that that water is gently getting in and getting in right at the base of that plant. Like usually we teach people you don't water directly on the plant, but a little bit away from the plant. But it's important when the plant is newly transplanted, the roots are still sort of clustered in that plug. And sometimes the water just runs along the edge of the plug. It also happens in potted plants. If you have a really dry potted plant, you can water it till the water comes out of the bottom of the pot and stick your finger in about 1 inch from the stem of the plant, and it can be totally dry. So you want to be mindful of that when you're watering your transplants. So for watering, there is no instant like water on Tuesday and Friday for tomatoes and Sunday and Wednesday for cucumbers or whatever. You have to check the soil. And as master gardeners, that's something that we really work hard to share with the public, that it's not even the pots that you're familiar with and the soil that you're familiar with, you have all these conditions. You have the atmospheric, the humidity, you have the wind, you have the temperature, you have the container material. If the container is a black plastic versus a glazed ceramic, you may have 10 tomatoes on your porch, and maybe some are in a black plastic and some are in a brown plastic, some are in a wooden container, maybe a glazed pot and an unglazed pot. They'll all have different moisture levels. So you want to make sure that you're checking the soil before you water. And for most of your fruits and vegetables, bitterness, cracking, uneven production, it's all caused by lack of water or uneven watering. I am the queen of forgetting to water and then overwatering and then forgetting to water. And like that is my cycle. I am very consistently inconsistent. And that's why a lot of home vegetables, especially cucumbers, for example, taste very bitter. If you grow them at home, it's that uneven watering, that inconsistent. And if you don't take away anything else from today's talk, consistent watering where the soil is evenly moist, and then it is drying just very slightly, but definitely not soggy, like a wrung out sponge, that will lead to your best flavor. For tomatoes, they'll often split if they get too much water. And a lot of times the navel oranges, if we have a big rain, they'll split because we can't stop the rain. And you think about the fruit has a fixed size, and then when it swells with moisture, then it cracks open. So you want to make sure even watering is the most important. Getting to know your soil, doing the soil jar test will help you know, do you have a lot of clay soil? You're probably not going to have to water as often. You want to perhaps buy plants, especially larger plants like trees. You want to buy plants that are going to tolerate that heavier clay soil. If your soil's very sanding, you're going to want to water more often. And then just pay attention to the weather changes and even the fires. I was amazed when we had those fires in like the Bobcat fire and the ones in Oak Glen. It peeled off some of the paint on my house because I have like a pretty old house on the west side where the wind was coming from the Bobcat fire. And it also just, my plants got so dry. And it's really interesting. If you'll observe, before we get a rain event, the pots will often dry out much more quickly because the moisture is getting drawn into the atmosphere. So a lot of times right before a rain, we'll have very dry, I'll often have to water right before a rain. So if you're like, oh, the plant can wait until tomorrow because it's going to rain, check especially your potted plants. A little bit different for the soil, but so you want to keep it evenly moist, okay? And then vegetables are 80 to 95% water, so they're going to suffer in quality and quantity very quickly with improper watering. And so your irrigation is affected by the particular plants, your soil, your water application rate, and plant root depth. And so if you have questions about watering, reach out to our Master Gardener helpline and keep your soil evenly moist, especially during germination and the first few weeks of establishment. You want to watch out for salts, especially in your potted plants, and for things like avocados are very susceptible to salt burn. So the salts are naturally occurring in our soil. They're also a result of fertilizer. So as you're fertilizing, if you see, this leaf is probably the best example. If you see browning on the margin of the leaf, but you see the new growth here is very green. This looks like it might be a plant that dried out, and usually it's even less. It's like the rest of the leaf looks fine, but the edges will be brown. That's an indication of salt burn. And again, those are just nutrients that are in excess. It's just sort of like they tell us don't take too many vitamins. It's hard on our kidney or liver or whatever. And it's the same thing. So if you see salt burn, again, you can reach out to our Master Gardener helpline to help diagnose it. But if you see salt burn, what you want to do is flush the soil. So in your potted plants, you would want to water it really well. If it's a tree like an avocado and you're seeing that, you need to flush the soil as best you can. And it's pretty common to see on years where we don't have a lot of rain. Sprinkler, drip irrigation is a great way to go. Saves water. Drip irrigation, you just want to make sure you're getting enough water to your plant. And we will be doing an irrigation workshop online this spring. So check our website for that. And so basically you can see that sand holds a lot less water than clay, which can be a good and a bad thing. Soaker hoses can work. There's also the porous pipe are some different choices. And we talked already. So if you have a very clay-like soil, the water is going to move more horizontally. So your drip emitters can be farther away from your plants. If you have very sandy soil here on the left, then the water is going to go more straight down. And those drip emitters maybe need to be closer to your tree or to your vegetables. So if you're doing a drip irrigation, then be mindful of those things in placement. I always laugh at this picture because this is like the field test, and we usually encourage people to stick their finger in the soil and see if the soil is damp. If I had this, like my sandy soil probably wouldn't even do this. So the dry example for a sandy soil, that's probably what my sandy soil looks like when it's wet. And this would be like a very heavy clay-like soil. So if you're on the northern end of the valley, then you're not going to get that clumping. So instead of using the field test like that, stick your finger in the ground and dig below the surface and see how wet it is. Your different vegetables have different rooting depths. And so you want to make sure you're watering to the depth of your plant. And one of the things you can really do to harm your plants, especially your potted plants, and even the plants in the ground, is water too shallow. You want to encourage those roots to grow down so that when we have hot and dry weather, they're protected from that heat. So you want to encourage those plants to grow down. And this presentation will be on the website if you guys want to look more carefully at the chart. For garden tasks, we talked about compost and how it helps improve water holding capacity and drainage. We'll have a class on composting. I think it's on March 21st online, so you can check that out. We'll talk more about that. But it's a great way to recycle for your food. With the new legislation, the SB 1383, then it's also being mandated to reduce organic waste going into the landfill. But check out our composting workshop that will also be posted on our YouTube channel to learn more about that. I think because of time, we'll just sort of skip over this composting part since we have an upcoming composting workshop where we're going to spend a whole hour on it. But basically, compost is ready when it looks like soil and it's not humus-like, but humus-like, and it smells good. and you shouldn't recognize any of the inputs, and the pile should shrink to about the third of its size. And for compost, you're usually going to mix in about 2 to 4 inches. About 2 inches, you put a layer of 2 inches on your garden bed or in your potted plants and mix it down 4 to 6 inches into your soil if you're preparing your beds for vegetable growing. If you can't, for example, if you have like a perennial plant, like where you aren't wanting to disturb the roots or a larger bush, you can use compost as a mulch and just layer it on top, like 2 to 4 inches on top of the soil. Compost is a great amendment to the soil, but it's not a replacement for fertilizer. So it has pretty low nitrogen levels, but it's still a great amendment. It brings in a lot of organisms and different beneficial bacteria, and it's really crucial. So compost is great, but it's not a replacement for fertilizer. And for most of your fruits and veggies, I don't fertilize hardly anything. I fertilize my fruit trees, but I don't fertilize any of my ornamental plants. Sometimes I do my roses occasionally, and I definitely get my grandma fertilized every month, and she had an amazing, like she had nonstop blooms. So, you know, for your flowering plants, then fertilizer about every 4 to 6 weeks, and for your veggies to get a good crop, usually every 4 to 6 weeks. You can use an organic fertilizer or a conventional fertilizer. That's up to you. There's 3 numbers on the fertilizer packages, and the first number is nitrogen, second number is phosphorus, sorry, and the third number is potassium. And the nitrogen is the leaf maker, so that makes it green. The potassium, which is the third number, is kind of the flower and fruit maker. And the phosphorus, which is the second number, is the root maker. So if you're planting strawberries this spring, then it's not a bad idea to add some phosphorus rich, or this middle number here, this middle number, rich fertilizer, because that will help with root establishment. When in doubt, you can just use an all-purpose fertilizer. A lot of times you'll see a 10, 10, 10, or a 16, 16, 16. That's usually sufficient. This fertilizer here that they show on the package, that one has 32, is very high in nitrogen. And that's something you would use to green something up. Really commonly used for citrus and also used for lawns to have a high nitrogen fertilizer. It creates a lot of green growth. For most plants, you don't want a lot of green growth because it usually means you have to trim it back, right? So for your vegetables, you're just mostly looking for an all-purpose fertilizer. You'll see all kinds of special fertilizers in the market for different plants, for tomatoes, for this and that. Unless it's a plant that's an acid-loving plant, like a blueberry or an azalea, then for the most part, it doesn't matter. And those will show signs of nutrient deficiencies because they need extra iron for those. And so that's actually not one of these 3 numbers. So for your veggie fertilizer, you want to use like an all-purpose fertilizer. Sometimes you'll see ones that will say they're a blossom maker or something like that. And that's going to be a plant that is high in potassium, that third number. But usually you can just use an all-purpose fertilizer. Just for your reference, the pH of your soil impacts what nutrients are available. So most nutrients are available between 6 and 7 pH. So sort of like not acidic, not basic soil. You can see that most of these nutrients are available in the soil. But for plants that are acid loving, you see that the higher the pH goes, the less iron there is available. So a lot of times they'll say like an acid loving plant will yellow. And it yellows because it's not getting enough iron, because it needs, down in this lower range, access to the iron. So a lot of times when you buy a fertilizer for an acid loving plant, it has iron in it to help boost its iron concentration. So if you had a blueberry growing in a pH of 7 soil, and most of our native soil is between 7 and 8, and most potting soil is 6 to 7. So right in that central range, but our native soil can be a little bit basic or a little bit high in pH. If you just continued to give that plant extra iron, it wouldn't really matter that the pH is high. There's a few other things that happen. But so just for these acid loving plants, like azaleas, rhododendrons, you might want to buy special fertilizer. For the rest of them, so, and some people ask, should we do, because the pH impacts the fertilizer, then should we do pH tests on the soil? And the home pH kits that you can get are usually not that reliable, and you have to think about where you're testing in the soil. And so we usually just tell people, look for signs of nutrient deficiency in your plant and then work backwards from there. The one plant you might not want to do that on, or the vegetables, is things that have previously shown signs of blossom end rot from calcium deficiency. That's where you'll see on the bottom, either the flowers will drop, or you'll see on the bottom of the fruit, it will be kind of rotten. So I had that in my tomatoes last year, which tells me there must not be enough calcium in my soil. Adding things like eggshells, while eggshells are calcium rich, that calcium is tied up in the eggshell for quite a long time. It doesn't hurt your soil. It probably adds to the microorganism party down there. And eventually it will break down, but it's not going to be a quick fix. And unfortunately for things like eggplants and tomatoes especially will get that. By the time you see that damage on the fruit, it is already too late in the process. So this year when I plant my tomatoes, I'm probably going to give them calcium before they start flowering, because they need that calcium when they're flowering. And D, I'm almost done. Okay, you want to keep the weeds pulled. Our natural resources advisor, Chris McDonald, he talked in this last year's class, Master Gardener class, about a study they had done on crops. I think it was corn, and that corn that had weeds, when it was less than like 3 inches tall, had like a 30% reduction in yield, even though they kept it weeded the rest of the time. And I thought that was so interesting. I was like, well, the weeds are there, the plant is young, it doesn't really matter. Apparently weeds around, studies have shown that weeds around your young vegetables will impact your crop, your production yield later. So keep your plants weeded, or there's a weed guide that we'll share in the resources. You know, it starts as 1 and then the growth becomes exponential. But what I was going to say was that mulch, and maybe there's a mulch slide in here. Mulch is a great way to keep weeds down. Okay. You want to make sure today at the 3 o'clock, we'll have a pest management class. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically for all your pests, you want to properly ID them. You want to decide, is this pest really causing harm to the garden? Can it be tolerated? Sometimes a pest just shows up at the wrong time. And like I remember a couple of years ago, people were posting on Facebook how the lizards were eating all their plants because they saw lizards all around their plants. And it was the lizards were eating the caterpillars that were eating their plants. So they were going to get rid of their lizards in mass. And everybody on social media was like, don't do it. So, but you see the lizards, you see the plant damage, you don't know. So you want to make sure you properly ID the pests. You want to treat your pests with the least toxic method. Consider the impacts on your beneficial insects, because we talked already, your caterpillars and your other insects are future pollinators, you know, so we want all these beautiful butterflies around, but we don't want the juveniles eating our plants. So it's a balance. We want to, and this woman, Christy Welhemini, I'm not saying her last name right, but Welhemini, she wrote a book, The Garden Nerd, and a couple of other books, and she is in Los Angeles, and she posted for her brassicas, because she didn't want to treat with any pesticides. She covers them with like a frost cloth or a row cover while they're several inches tall, and lets them grow up to be big enough so that the caterpillars can't decimate them. And then she pulls it back, because again, they don't need access to pollinators at that age, right? As long as the floating row cover is light enough, then you can put it over your vulnerable crops. Then she lifts it off and goes through and hand picks as the plants are older. And then for all of your pests, best practices, keeping your plants healthy is the best way. A plant that is well watered scientifically data shows that they will handle a spider mite infestation much better if they're well watered than if they're vulnerable, which is why a lot of times you'll see spider mites take over at the end of the season, especially as we've gotten, like, we're starting to get so many tomatoes, we're like, oh my goodness, and we start backing off on water, we're not paying as much attention. The spider mites come in because those plants are more susceptible. So keeping your plants healthy is really important. And then we talked already about keeping ants out of your plants as part of our way to bring the beneficial insects in. And our go-to site is the UC Integrated Pest Management site. And if you like to do your own research, check out that site. There's all kinds of tools to diagnose plant damage, plant disease. You can see all kinds of really great pictures, and then they have management strategies. But if you don't want to do that yourself, reach out to the Master Gardener Helpline and we can help you with that information. At this time of year, you probably could be doing in 1 week, it seems like, frost and heat protection. Like we had the frost last week and then we're supposed to have 81 or 82. And, you know, they're putting heat warnings out because, and I thought that was like, you know, 81 or 82 in the summer is like, this is great, right? But our bodies are not used to it. So especially if we have health conditions or whatever, then we're much more susceptible. And the plants are the same way. So you may be doing frost and shade cloth. It's kind of expensive, you know, and in a pinch, you could use a sheet. If you're using plastic for frost protection, you just want to make sure it's not touching the plant because we're at that point of contact, it can burn the plant. And then for the, you wouldn't use plastic, obviously, for like shade, right? But you can, I think it's probably, I've decided it's probably worth investing in a roll of good shade cloth. They're like $40 to $50 for a roll, but when you need it, it's nice to have it. In a pinch, you could use like a sheet and just have it lifted away. And then you can mulch for weed control, and like for strawberries, it helps keep snails and slugs away. Check out our seed saving classes. I encourage you to try to do some seed saving at home. Even if you're not initially successful or terrifically successful, it's really fun to engage in that part of the process of the plant's life. And so check out our free seed saving classes online. Tomatoes, herbs, lettuce, peas and beans are really easy ones to do, and harder ones to do are peppers and broccoli and onions. And so just remember, all veggies and fruits have these same requirements. They need enough space to grow. They need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. They want to be pretty much kept evenly moist, like a wrung out sponge. They probably are going to need fertilizer, whether you go organic or conventional. They're going to need a fertilizer probably at least every 4 to 6 weeks. And they like a high quality soil. And by saying that, I mean one that is well draining and rich in organic matter. So I encourage you to mix compost in. Herbs are great to grow, and maybe some microgreens. I love herbs because low pest pressure. They're great foundational plants during the mix of the season, right? We were just talking earlier about having parsley that's doing really well. And I normally try to plant parsley now, but my parsley overwintered really well and it looks amazing. And I have thyme and sage and rosemary all the time in the garden. So check those out. Great way to bring flavor into your kitchen. Planted most of them in Southern California, except for basil can be planted year round. Basil doesn't do well in the winter. Cilantro doesn't do well in the summer, but most all of them can be planted year round. Fennel and dill are going to kind of run through the summer and then be done. And some of them can be quite invasive, either by seed or by root. So you want to keep an eye on that. And so they do well, a lot of them in sun and shade. They do well in containers. Like I said, some of them can be invasive. They do well in pots. They do need well draining soil, and they don't do terrifically well inside. So a lot of times you see these really cute little window box things that you can buy, and they will do okay, but it's not like you're going to make pesto out of that basil plant. So if you have them inside just to be cute, or some people, like one of our master gardeners, Jeff, in the high desert, he grows like a whole assortment of tomatoes in his south facing window, and no pests because he grows them indoors. So I don't want to say never, but generally they don't do that well indoors. Here's a couple of resources that I'll share with you guys on the resource sheet. And so basically when you want to plant, this is for herbs. You want to determine if they're shade loving, sun loving, and you want to make sure you know if they're invasive or not. The Channel Islands or the Santa Cruz Islands have really been impacted by fennel. I think it has taken over. So just be mindful of some of these herbs. And then mint is the one with the reputation. And it normally doesn't take over by seed, it takes over by roots. Yeah. And so you could do a 3-tiered herb garden, lots of different ways you can grow your herbs. And so these are some 3, and this plant here on the right-hand side, it looks pretty bad, but it sat in my driveway for like a month without water in the summer. And all of these plants came back. And then this is a basil. This is what overwintering basil looks like in Southern California. It doesn't die, but it doesn't really basil itself out there. So, and then some of these things, you know, are super cute, but like this one in the upper left, it's got no drainage, right? And this one in the lower right, it's super pretty, but as soon as you start watering it, it's going to look so funky. I see people make planters out of pants, and they stuff jeans. And then after you water them for a while, they're all brown stained and pretty funky. So a lot of these things that look cute are not particularly practical. And herbs do best, just like vegetables, in well-draining soil. Soil rich in organic matter, or lavender and rosemary are like the Mediterranean herbs will do very well in a sandy soil. They don't like mulch. They don't like to be messed with. You just sort of plant them and leave them alone. And you harvest your herbs by cutting the leaves as they grow. If you want them to continue to leaf out, you can cut back the flower stalks. But when they do send out the flower stalks, it's a seed saving opportunity. Plus, all of your vegetable garden can be a pollinator garden. You know, if you think about, we don't let our cabbage and our lettuce and our broccoli go to flower, but when we do, they're really pretty flowers and the pollinators love them. And all of our summertime garden goes to flower, or most of it goes to flower and then fruit. So that's a pollinator garden. But if your cool season veggies go to flower, like your broccoli, darn, you can't eat the broccoli, but it's a pollinator opportunity. And the flowers are really pretty and interesting. So we talked about this. And if you're having things in containers, you just want to make sure for most vegetables, a 15-inch container, about 15 inches wide and 15 inches deep, is the appropriate size and depth for the container to get a good crop. You just want to make sure that you are fertilizing them about half as often, half as much, but twice as often, because they're more likely to get burned in a pot, but because you're not adding as much, then they need a little bit more. So if you were fertilizing every 6 weeks, maybe you would fertilize half as much every 4 weeks when you're vegetable gardening in a container. Make sure you're keeping an eye on their water. They still need it evenly moist. And then look for, there's a lot of companies that sell compact varieties for containers. So like, not promoting them as a master gardener, but Renee's Seeds has a whole line just for container gardening, because they want to encourage people to grow their vegetables right by their kitchen. So they've got squash and these things that are normally really massive, that are really clustered and compact in growth. So look for things that say compact growth or for container gardening for your vegetables. And in container gardening, just think about radiating heat off of your patio or porch or anything like that. And for growing in small spaces, it's sort of like the square foot gardening, making sure everything has enough space. I think for harvesting your plants, since we have our master food preservers here, then just make sure you're harvesting at the right time. Your root veggies should be harvested when they're the right size. Your leaf veggies can be harvested leaf by leaf. You don't have to harvest the whole plant. Your immature flower heads, you want to harvest them when they're just the right size before they get too big and they start to pop. For your fruits, you want to allow them to ripen. And a lot of times people are dissatisfied with their homegrown bell peppers because they harvest them too early. So you have to know what color that bell pepper is supposed to be. You know, sometimes people are harvesting a red bell pepper before it's fully colored, and the bell peppers will not continue to flavor after you've picked them. Tomatoes, and I tried it last year, tomatoes, once they've turned red, like just started to blush, nothing else comes from the plant, and they can harvest. So you can grow tomatoes at home, and if you have a lot of pest pressure, you can put your tomatoes inside once they've started to turn red, and they'll fully ripen with the flavor, just like a homegrown tomato, but without that pest pressure of being outside. So tomatoes, once they've started to blush, that's it for chemistry in the plant. All of the sugar changes happen inside the fruit. Bell peppers don't do that. So if you harvest them too early, that's probably why they don't taste good. A lot of times for eggplant, cucumber, squash, people harvest them too late, and that's when they can start to be bitter. So watching out for those and just making sure, and that just takes practice, and you can reach out to our helpline. And then for things like lettuce or radishes, or actually a lot of your plants, succession planting, where you plant, you know, maybe one this month and another one next month, or maybe every 2 weeks is another way, if you really want to eat out of your garden, to extend that season. So I'll share these resources on our website on a resource sheet, and sign up for our newsletter on our website, and check us out on social media, and reach out to our Master Gardener helpline if you have any questions. And thank you so much for joining us today.